So a near-death experience seems to promote or initiate these really interesting psychological shifts in people that, in psychology we often can't achieve through therapy. So another common what we might call an after effect of the experience is this loss of the fear of death. It seems to eliminate that fear that I think we live with, perhaps unconsciously throughout our lives. And then, of course, there are usually these really other beneficial changes. People often change their worldview and recognise the importance of positive connection with others and tolerance and love. And one of the other really interesting changes is this sense of heightened care for the environment.
Hello there, Dr. Natasha Tassell-Matamua, Associate Professor of Psychology at Massey University, Aotearoa, New Zealand, who has become a leading light in the research of spirituality and the after effects of near-death experiences, NDEs, they're often called. Now, I just want to say I'm totally impressed with Massey University that they have been so open to date to even backing you with this. So it makes me feel really good that that is happening. But you also have another rather fascinating project of late called Te Tatu o Te Po, Door of the Night. Would you tell us a little bit about that and what the focus is, please, Natasha?
Sure. Thanks for having me here, Susie. So Te Tatau o Te Po is, as you mentioned, it's a new-ish project, and has been running now for not quite a year. And what the project explores is those really interesting and unusual experiences that occur actually quite frequently in relation to death. So they are experiences that someone might have witnessed in someone who is dying. And some examples of things they might have witnessed is, for example, someone suddenly becoming very lucid just before they die and saying, "Oh, look, John's here," and John is the deceased husband or deceased son that passed away 20 years ago. And they might say, "Oh, John's here. Oh, he's come to get me," and then start having a conversation with John and then die very, very happily. Or they might, for example, people with dementia not have any recollection of who their son or daughter is, and then just prior to death suddenly become lucid and recognise them, have a really meaningful conversation, and then die. So it's those types of experiences that have been directly witnessed that we're looking at, as well as experiences where people may not have been with the dying person when they passed over, but something's happened. There's been some sort of synchronicity where they've recognised that what's happened is directly related to the death of another. So, for example, they might suddenly just have this feeling at the moment someone's died, and then they later recognise that, that was something happening that allowed them to think about that person when they died. So just these really interesting, there are many experiences, but really interesting things that happen in relation to the death of someone.
Door of the Night. What? Door of the Night. Beautiful. That's such a beautiful phrase. Is that a turn of phrase in Māori, or it is? Can you explain that a little? Yeah.
Yeah. So in Māori belief systems, we have this idea that we are wairua, or spirit, that inhabits a physical form, and then when we pass away, when the physical form dies, the wairua lives on, and it releases itself from the physical body at the moment of death and journeys into or back to Hawaii, which is I understand it as a spiritual realm. And so there's this period between being an embodied physical entity and then being non-embodied. And it's that period, te tatau o te pō, which is sort of the precipice between physical life and spiritual life. So that's sort of the underlying meaning of the name, and it's that transition point that name refers to. So te tatau o te pō, and in English it means the door of the night. So I think it's really apt as a name for this project.
Perfect name for this project, which of course is more the slight difference from NDEs. It's more about transitioning experiences captured at the time, overheard, or which is just a very is a different stage, as you say. And tell me, is that something Māori find easy, or is the focus purely on Māori, and is this a subject people find easy to discuss?
For this project, we're wanting to collect experiences from Māori and understand what they look like and what they mean, and in particular how people apply meaning to them in relation to the cosmos. How do they? Because of course that's another belief, is that when people die, they sort of journey off into the cosmos, which could be Hawaii, and become stars, and sit there for eternity. So I think that's very metaphorical, but that's sort of the gist of the understanding. So for this particular project, yes, just Māori experiences is what I'm hoping to capture and just look at a little bit more. But what was your other question?
Do people find it easy to share these experiences with you?
Yes, yeah. I think it depends. I found that with my NDE research that near-death experiences appear to be more readily acceptable to Māori. So, I'll explain a near-death experience, and they'll be like, oh yeah, it's. I think because it's part of our ontology as Māori, it's part of our worldview, that the idea that a near-death experience can happen and does happen is very easily, it's very relatable. And I think it's the same with these te tatau o te pō experiences. They're part of our worldviews, our beliefs. So people find them quite easy to relate to, or to say, oh yes, of course, I've seen that, or I've heard that, or so they can relate to them. I think with people who are non-Māori, I think the answer is it depends. So I think in general conversations, these experiences are common. They appear to commonly occur, and people will, once I open up about them, then I tend to find that they'll offer their own experience as well. In academic circles, not so readily discussed, for all sorts of reasons. So that's why I say it depends on who I'm talking to and who the audience is. But by and large, I think the te tatau o te pō experiences, a lot of people have examples of them happening. And speaking to, for example, hospice nurses, they're like, oh yeah, they happen all the time. So I think, it depends on who you talk to in the setting. But they do appear to be more frequent than I think maybe academia realises.
And are they uttered words of a vision, or what are they describing often?
so that people who've witnessed them, or a range of things. So it might be, I think, what appears to be very, very common is the seeing a deceased other who's come to collect, for want of a better word, or come to take them with them. I think that's very, very common. Some people describe seeing like a mist, or those who have been present at the death, like a mist or something appearing to leave the body. Some people describe sharing, and like the podcast you've done previously, the shared death experience. Some people describe having like the sharing and the transition of the person. Others just describe this seeing the light around the body, or just as if there's an otherworldly feel to what's happening, and they're sort of taken away momentarily and then they come back. There's usually a lot of positive emotion associated with witnessing these experiences. I'm not sure I've ever had anyone describe them to me in a devastatingly emotional way. There's usually the sense of privilege and honour to have been part or witnessed that experience. So there's a lot that's described, but most certainly the seeing a deceased other who's come to get them is very common.
And you're marrying, am I correct in thinking you're marrying these experiences up with Māori culture's system of astronomy?
Yes. Yeah.
And how that plays into the entire experience, if you like.
Absolutely. Yeah. So what this project is doing, and it's really interesting, but what we're wanting to do is to actually, maybe if I describe the idea that I had, then it might make a little bit.
Yeah, your intention. What was your intention? Yeah.
Well, I like sitting out at night and gazing at the stars. And I was out one night sitting outside with my husband by our outdoor fire, and I just sort of said to him, I wonder if there's any influence of the movement of the stars on, or the cosmos, on these experiences that happen at the end of life. And I'd been reading prior to that about research that's been done in Western academia about the influence of the moon phases on particular things. So there's been some research that's looked at the incidence of sudden infant death syndrome and related it to the phases of the moon and other death-related phenomena. And so even though that research is sound in terms of methodology, I think it's been maybe not popularised as much, just because it just looks a bit crazy to some people that, well, how would the moon affect, suicide or anything like that?
But lunacy, the whole,
exactly.
Gosh, so much water, aren't we? We are totally affected by the moon.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So I'd really taken, I had this personal interest, but then I had this scholarly interest. Well, what research is out there? And so I began exploring different studies that had been done looking at the influence of the moon on various death-related phenomena. And then, as I was sitting out by the fire with my husband, I was like, I wonder if the same can be said for these end-of-life experiences. And then that got me thinking, well, I wonder if we could relate it for Māori in particular, relate it to our understandings of, for example, the maramataka or matariki or different phases of the cosmos throughout the year. And so that's what the project is doing, collecting accounts, including objective information like the date when the person died and the circumstances, etc. And then we are looking to retrofit that onto, well, where was the movement of particular celestial bodies at that time? And is there any pattern? So we're just looking to see, well, if there is, experiences that sort of look like this or have these particular features, does that correlate in any way to where particular cosmic objects were? So it's quite left field for Western scholarship. But I think from a Māori perspective and Indigenous perspective, it's not necessarily so, because we believe that everything's connected, and of course something occurring out in the cosmos naturally must affect us in some way.
It's fascinating, and I think we've all grown up hearing all about these, as you say, moments of lucidity, perhaps from the person passing. But to give this all a little bit of context, I do want to sort of loop back to your work with NDEs, near-death experiences, which was your research for many years. And I'm just assuming you didn't grow up thinking, I know what I'm going to do. I'm going to research NDEs. So how did you tell us a little bit how you got into this field of study, and was there a catalyst?
Sure, yeah. No, I didn't grow up thinking I nailed it, I know what I'm going to do. Far from it, actually. But there were a couple of things that eventually led me into this line of work, this line of research. And the first thing was my mother passed away when I was very young, and I mean, that affects you in all sorts of ways when a parent dies. But when she passed away, I was 6.5, and I was there when she passed away. And she had, or as she was passing away, she was talking us through what was happening. So she talked about seeing a light and feeling at peace, and then seeing a tunnel, and then she passed away, and then a few minutes later came back and said, oh, there's a heaven, I've been there, and it's beautiful, and then passed away again. So that was a really early childhood experience that I guess you package it away when you've had this quite traumatic grief as a young child. You sort of package it away and it just sort of gets put to the side. But it's come back later in life, and I realise actually this has been a really pivotal moment in my life that has directed all sorts of things. But there was that experience. And then when I was an older teenager, I had an experience which I now recognise as a near-death experience. I didn't at the time. I was very confused about what had happened. But I was quite unwell one day, and I'm not a lie down and be sick person. I'm an actively sick in denial. I'm not really sick sort of person. But on this particular day, I lay down, and I don't really know what happened other than I think I lost consciousness, and, well, I lost the ability for physical responsivity. I didn't lose consciousness because I was very conscious, just not in my body. And I just remember travelling through a tunnel at really, really what appeared to be a really, really fast speed, not my physical body, but my consciousness. And being, if I'm being honest, a little bit frightened because I wasn't sure what was happening, but travelling through this tunnel towards a bright light, and it had a silhouette of what I describe as a being in that light. And then I just, for whatever reason, communicated telepathically, I guess you could call it, to the being, look, I'm not ready yet. And at that point I was stopped and then sent back through the tunnel and came back to physical responsivity in my body, and just had a really high fever and was covered in sweat. So at the time, I was only 18, I thought, was that an alien encounter? Because that's the only, I'd never heard of an experience. It was the only reference point that I had for trying to figure out what had happened. And then I thought, oh, of course it wasn't. And I just didn't speak about it because it was so unusual and so weird, and I really didn't know what had happened. And it wasn't until a bit later that I read a book, the Tibetan Book of Living and Dying, and in that book they talk about near-death experiences and described something that was very similar to what had happened to me, and I thought, maybe that's it. But I didn't actually come into this area of research for, not till my early 30s, so a good 10 to 12 years after my experience, that I began to have an interest. Yeah.
Did you tell anyone about it at the time?
Not at the time, no. I was, I guess, like I mentioned, about 18, and I don't know, there's all sorts of social norm things going on, and so no, I didn't. But I did eventually tell my dad about it, who was really affirming, and he was like, oh yes, I've heard of those, I think they're near-death experiences, and was just I think perhaps it was a father thing, I'm not sure, but he just made it feel okay to have had that experience, and so that was very affirming for me. I'm not sure I could have maybe disclosed that immediately after I'd had it, because it was just too different to me. At the time, it felt too weird. Of course, now I don't see it like that at all. Mm-hmm.
The figure that you saw, did you know who that was? Your mum, or have you any sense of who it was?
I have no sense. I don't feel it was, the energy of my mother. I really don't know what the being was, but to me it felt benevolent and understanding, and not commanding or dominating the experience in any way. Just there, waiting. So that's how it felt. Yeah.
So was this happened at age 18? That's quite young, isn't it? And was it life-changing for you? Did it change you in any way?
Yes. At the time, I didn't sort of recognise that. But I know immediately after the experience, I became very interested in Buddhism. And now I can relate it back to the experience. At the time, I just had this sudden urge to learn about that, and so I did, and that's what sort of led me to read that book, the Tibetan Book of Living and Dying. So I had that sort of urge, and I also had this. I just started university at the time, and I had this sort of feeling that it wasn't enough for me. Like the university system didn't hold the knowledge that I needed. So I left university, and I just felt that I needed to travel and explore, and I felt like I was seeking something. I just wasn't sure what I was seeking at the time. Okay. So, and there were other changes, other personal changes that occurred, which I recognise now, but at the time I didn't. And at the time, of course, I hadn't told my dad and my siblings about the experience. So all they could see were all these changes happening, but no context for them. So I think they found that quite concerning. But now I reflect back. And in fact, it wasn't till I was supervising a student to do her master's. This is maybe 8, possibly 10 years ago now, and she was looking at near-death experiences and changes that occur to people that have them. And she'd completed a few interviews, and then, she came back and we discussed the interviews, and she said, one of the funny things is that I'll ask people about the changes that have occurred after their near-death experience, and they all say, no, I don't remember any changes. And then she said, but then they'll all go on and talk about changes that occurred after the experience. And it was our conversation that made me stop and think, oh, well, I didn't have any changes after my experience. And then I began to think, oh actually, no, I did. So it was that point where I started to reflect and realise actually there were a whole heap of changes that occurred.
If your dad sort of the penny dropped for him too, because you told him you were going away first, and then leaving university, that's quite big for a dad, to quite go big. Away.
Yeah.
And then later, am I right? Later told him about this experience. Yeah. So I wonder if that was a bit of a for him, maybe.
May have been.
Yeah. Wow. So you've come back. You came back. You obviously did a psychology degree extensively. Actually, you became doctorate in it, and you've gone on to really dive into this subject big time. And what are some of the and has it been just New Zealand focused?
No. So most of the near-death experience research, so with speaking to people, has been here, based in New Zealand. But I've connected out over the years to researchers in other parts of the world, and am currently involved in a study with a group of international researchers looking at something known as terminal lucidity, which is, as I mentioned at the beginning of our conversation, the people who have dementia, as an example, and for all intents and purposes, if we assume that the breakdown of the brain sort of causes dementia, then for all intents and purposes, because of the deterioration of the brain, there shouldn't be any return to lucidity at any stage. And yet, just before they die, they become very lucid and return to normal everyday cognitive functioning, which is very paradoxical, given established ideas and models about brain functioning and consciousness and how it should work. And yet these cases of terminal lucidity just before death completely contradict everything that is understood about brain functioning and dementia. So that's another study that I'm doing with an international group. But most of the NDE, well, pretty much all of the near-death experience research has been based here in Aotearoa.
And are there common themes? I mean, you've hinted that there have been, that, that on reflection, people realise how it perhaps alters their path of life subtly, perhaps not hugely. But are there common themes within the actual experience itself, the tunnel? I mean, I'm feeling that there are, but is that so? Or can it vary quite broadly?
It seems to be that there are commonalities. So no two near-death experiences are identical, but there do seem to be some really common features. So the feelings of peace and joy and sort of just really positive emotions during the experience is really common, although not always. There are exceptions, of course. Seeing a being of light, what people often describe as a spiritual being, is very common. The sort of experience of being disembodied, or feeling like they are having or have had what we might consider an out-of-body experience, again, very common. The seeing deceased others, deceased significant others, very common. The tunnel aspect, it seems to be common, but not necessarily always described as a tunnel. So some people might describe it as a void or some other feature. But, in the English language, we might just say, oh, okay, that's sort of akin to a tunnel. There are a lot of things that appear to occur, not in every NDE, but occur commonly across them. And even though most of the research has been done in the English language and in what we might consider Western countries, though the reports that have been sort of gathered from non-English speaking countries and what we might consider non-Western countries, they seem to show the same sort of features, or people report the same sort of things. So I don't want to say it appears to, the features of a near-death experience are universal, but they appear to be, or at least have the potential to be universal. Yeah.
Interesting. And does the attitude towards death for the individual change after that?
By and large, yes. Yeah. So another common what we might call an after effect of the experience is this loss of the fear of death. And when you unpack that a little bit more with people, they'll often say, well, I'm not afraid of dying, but they might be apprehensive about, for example, as a mother, dying and leaving young children, or they might be apprehensive about the nature of their death, but the actual process and what might occur after. That seems to, having a near-death experience seems to eliminate that fear that I think we live with, perhaps unconsciously throughout our lives. So that's very common, this loss of the fear of death. And then, of course, there are usually these really other beneficial changes, although they may not appear that way at first, but people often change their worldview, for want of a better word, and recognise the importance of, positive connection with others and tolerance and love. And one of the other really interesting changes is this sense of heightened care for the environment, as well as a reduced sort of sense of materialism and consumerism. So a near-death experience seems to promote or initiate these really interesting psychological shifts in people that, in psychology we often can't achieve through therapy. So
gosh, it feels like the whole world should go through a near-death experience, to be perfectly honest. We'll all be a lot better off for it.
Yeah.
Yeah, amazing. And is there a more heightened consciousness with the individual? I mean, you've just answered that question to a degree. There's an awareness of connection, but are they more open to their consciousness in terms of perhaps wanting to meditate more, or having other visions, or does that open up a door or not?
They can do near-death experiences. So the reporting of psychic, well, I'll just call them psychic abilities, but I think I like the way you frame it, more sort of heightened consciousness or heightened awareness of one's potential is definitely there for a lot of people, not everyone, and not everyone immediately. Sometimes the near-death experience can be such a contrast to one's worldview or one's perspective about reality that when people come back from it, it can take a little while to what we call, from a research perspective, integrate the experience into their life and figure out what it means and how they can continue navigating. But yes, certainly this, back to your question, this sense of heightened awareness of one's potential and abilities is often there, and that can manifest through, for example, people feeling like they have, psychic abilities and, stuff like that, which is really interesting and fascinating, I think. The other thing actually is this.
Oh, no, sorry. So sorry. Did that happen for you?
I don't know. I think yes and no. Like I never, and again, I wasn't aware of any changes in myself until I reflected, a decade later. But I think, so I'm saying no, I didn't notice any, but at the same time, I sort of look back now and I think, oh, actually, there are these just things that I'm perhaps more aware of, or things that happen, and I relate it to some other occurrence. So I wouldn't say psychic abilities that were obvious or anything like that, but I think a heightened awareness that I've become more aware of over time.
I interrupted you before. You were about to say something. What is interesting?
Well, sometimes people report knowledge, so related to the heightened awareness, just knowledge of things that they didn't have before. So I didn't personally speak with this lady, but a colleague of mine in the States mentioned how someone that he'd spoken to about her near-death experience suddenly came back with this knowledge about quantum physics that that wasn't even her area of expertise or profession. And then she suddenly just had all of this apparently accurate knowledge and information about that, which, was unexplainable. The only thing that sort of occurred was a near-death experience. So that I've heard other stories related to this knowledge acquisition that can't be explained.
Have there been any standout NDEs for you that have really made you think, wow?
I think there has been one, and this one was recounted to me by an ICU nurse, and he hadn't had a near-death experience, but one of his patients he was looking after, who was quite well known for his criminal activity, the patient, died, appeared to die, have a near-death experience, and he came back, and his experience wasn't a pleasant one. He recounted to the ICU nurse that he'd been to hell, for want of a better description, but in doing that he recognised how horrible he'd been to people, and that he needed to change. So I didn't hear that experience from the person who had it. I heard it secondhand, but that really stood out to me as for a couple of reasons. I guess the first is that it was an example of an unpleasant near-death experience, whereas a lot of people talk about, their experience being very pleasant and wonderful, and it reduces, their fear of death or eliminates their fear of death. So it stood out to me because it wasn't pleasant. And then the other thing that really stood out was the fact that it brought such an awareness to the person who had it that, when he came back from death, he was like, oh my gosh, I've recognised the harm I've caused and I really need to change. So that was an immediate sort of impact of the experience on this person. So for those two reasons, it's really stuck in my mind over the years.
Almost like a reboot or a 360 turn of understanding. It's pretty amazing. Okay, so How do you get your people to, how do you find these people? I mean, is it just a case of going to the marae and saying, look, we're looking for this, if you hear of anyone, kind of come forth?
Yeah, I mean, it's pretty much word of mouth. Social media. So at the moment, I've put posts on our project Facebook page and Instagram, and then the Centre for Indigenous Psychologies, which is also where I'm affiliated to at Massey, puts stuff on their Facebook page. So at the moment, it's social media advertising in the hope that we'll just capture an opportunistic sample of people, as well as word of mouth and stuff like that. I think for these types of experiences, people will offer them if they feel comfortable enough, and that's sort of I guess what's being relied on.
I totally get it. It's a tricky one, but you're getting there. It's working. So that's interesting. And over the years, I mean, you must have, how many NDEs have you discovered over the years? Has it been in the thousands or?
I'd say at least 1,000
Yeah.
over. So I've been actively researching NDEs for 16 years, and I've spoken to lots and lots and lots of people. I'd say at least 1,000 people, and so I think people are out there. It's just the extent to which they're willing to share their stories, and I think the extent to which they trust that those stories are going to be honoured and used in a way that is honouring them, the NDE, but for people who have passed away, and their te tatau te core experiences, honouring those people as well. So, yeah, they're out there, and I'm happy to speak to people about their experiences. I mean, it's always an honour for me to hear them, even if they sort of aren't sort of utilised in a research sort of way. Just hearing the stories is always very reaffirming and an honour. And I think for me, it always allows me to stop, reflect on life purpose and stuff. So it's nice.
And that was going to be my next question. Where is this body of research leading you, Natasha? What's it offering you?
Yeah, I think for me, I feel like it's my purpose in life to maybe elevate awareness about these experiences, although I know people are aware of them, but maybe elevate them into the consciousness of particular populations. So, for example, scholarly populations, the Western sort of scholarship, where there's limited funding, there's limited acceptance, really, of these types of experiences because they don't conform to established understandings about the nature of reality. So for me, I feel like that's my purpose, to gently and continuously usher them into a scholarly space where, because scholarship does inform public discourse and public policy, and so usher them in and I think highlight just how important, life-changing, beneficial they are for those that have them, but even people who learn about them. So that's what really drives me to keep doing this.
I just want to thank you for doing it and encourage you to keep going with it. I think it's in a pivotal time this is happening. You're doing this, and it's very important that we as humanity become much more at home with death. It's just more at peace with death. And this is another way of perhaps helping people to not have quite the fear around transitioning as they perhaps do. So that's a service of itself. Look, I want to thank you so much for being here today, Natasha. It's been fascinating, and I'm dying to know where it goes now. I really want to update the website and let us know, and I'll put your contacts all on the in the story notes, so that if anyone is watching and can contribute to it, that would be amazing.
That would be wonderful. Thanks so much, Susan.
Okay, thank you, and look forward to seeing you again sometime.
Wonderful. Thank you.